Hey guys, so I was just sitting here kind of enjoying dinner and because Cane's is amazing. So one thing that I just felt that I wanted to talk about was in Christianity, the idea that everything is an attack from the devil. No. Just no. Not everything is an attack from the devil, and don't pray to God to bail you out of every situation, because it's just kind of ridiculous. I grew up in a Christian household, and whenever something was going wrong in our lives, it was pray to God that he makes it better, pray to God that he makes it better. And the devil is after us. The devil is trying to break us apart. The devil is putting us through all of these trials, or maybe God is testing us or something like that. It's like, how about you just created this for yourself? I felt really strongly about this, because this is something that tends to kind of bring Christians together a lot, that this idea that there are external forces that are trying to undermine your life. And although that may be true at a small scale, as far as God in the universe is concerned, just understand when something is something that you created versus something that you are going through spiritually. A perfect example is my parents do not manage their finances well at all. They, and that's not their fault necessarily. It's just something that, managing finances is a skill, and that's just a skill that they never learned. And they both grew up in extremely poor households and all that kind of stuff, and they never really dealt with any of that mentality, any of those mentalities, and so they kind of maintained that throughout their life. Well, one day my dad decided he was going to sell his house, and boy, oh boy, he sold his house for $500,000. That's a lot of money. The problem is, no matter how Christian my parents were, incredibly Christian, insanely Christian, right? I mean, church every Sunday, choir, involved in the church, all that kind of stuff, right? When they started getting a lot of money, the $500,000, because he owned the house outright, so he was just essentially being gifted $500,000. He paid $97,000 for the house, and he just so happened to buy kind of in the right area, and his house became a commercial property. So when he got gifted the $500,000, he became an emotional wreck. And the reason is because he just didn't know how to manage the finances, He didn't know how to manage the finances, and his response was, and my mom's response was, the devil is testing us, the devil is testing us, all this kind of stuff. When they really just couldn't see that they couldn't handle the emotional response to having a lot of money. And so what they did was they very quickly squandered all the money. They bought a house for $175,000, and the remainder of the money quickly disappeared within about 2 years. And now they're back in the same place where they were at, which is owning a small home, a very small house, and just not having any money in the bank. And, that's not to judge them. That's not to say that they're lesser or anything like that. But the entire process, they were saying that it was the devil that was after them. The devil was after them, and they were praying to God, bail us out of this situation, out of these emotions and all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't that the devil was after them. It was just that they had not dealt with that. They just didn't have the emotional capacity to handle the money. And I see this kind of thing all the time with Christians, whether it's money, whether it's relationships, whether it's hardships, whether it's work, whether it's finances. We tend to put ourselves into these situations where, emotionally, we're going through a lot, right? Maybe we ended a relationship or something like that, and now we're just distraught, and it's trying and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things to realize is that you're the one that's creating that struggle. You're the one that's creating that suffering, right? A perfect example is whenever I used to be married, I used to get incredibly upset that my ex-wife wouldn't go to church. It bothered me because we were both Christian. I was Baptist, she was Pentecostal, and for the most part, we were going to her church. But it really incredibly bothered me that she didn't want to go to church, period. And her and I would have a lot of fights about that, which is kind of a funny thing to fight about, right? And the thing is, they weren't small fights. I mean, the household I grew up in was incredibly chaotic, aggressive fighting. And if you decided that you didn't want to go to church, you were quite literally abused into going to church. I mean, grab you, throw you in the car naked, and let you get dressed on the way to church kind of thing. I mean, there was no compassion, no patience in my house if you weren't going to go to church, right? God was utmost, the highest thing, and they just don't care how much they had to beat you and abuse you and talk down to you to get you to go to church. You were going to go to church. But so I got incredibly upset, and I remember creating for myself this amount of tension, this stress, constant stress of my ex-wife. She's not going to church. I want her to go to church. God wants her to go to church. Why isn't she being more Christian, and all this kind of stuff? And the thing is, I could easily stop, pull back my expectations, release all of the stress, and say, you know what, it's in God's timing. If God wants her to go to church, if God doesn't want her to go to church, she's on her own spiritual path. And that's not my territory to judge her. It's not my territory to criticize her. But because I was incredibly Christian at the time, I saw it as Satan was after my wife, and I'd be damned if I was going to let the devil win. And so because of that came a lot of abusive arguments, came a lot of intensely disgusting fights about something that should be about peace, something that should be about love. One of the most intense fights that we had about going to church was we were yelling at each other, and we were both raised in incredibly chaotic environments and hadn't dealt with our childhood traumas, because in Christianity, you don't deal with your childhood traumas and try to dissect your psyche. You just pray them away, and they never go away. And when they do come back up, you just say, oh, it's the devil and he's trying to get after me. It's like, no, it's just your childhood trauma, and you could deal with it yourself. It's not easy, but you could address it yourself. So we got into these intense fights. The most intense fight we got into, we were screaming, hollering, yelling at each other, and we started throwing things, not at each other, just out of anger, throwing things at the wall, throwing things across the room, and it was just explosive anger, kind of childhood mimicry, if you would, but explosive anger over something that was about going to church. I went to the pastor about it, and I said, I am incredibly angry because my ex-wife doesn't want to go to church. And I was kind of explaining the situation to him, and the response he gives is, the devil has got your ex-wife, and we need to pray for her, and we need to pray that God breaks her, and we need to pray that God brings her to her knees. What is that? Right? What is that? What kind of aggression is that? Praying that the almighty loving God break a person. And it's funny because growing up in church, we were taught not to deal with witches, not to deal with witchcraft, not to get close to divination because it was sinful, demonic, all these kind of things. And I'm not a witch or anything like that, but we were taught to stay away from these things. And it's funny because Christianity is just as damaging. Asking God to break a person is very, very close to black magic, if you would, I mean, what is black magic? It's wishing harm on someone, And I remember my pastor at the time said, God is going, and not just my pastor, but her family, because her family was incredibly Christian. And I shared my stresses of their daughter not going to church. And they were just like, well, we just have to pray that God breaks her into submission, And it was just like, this is very much as close to witchcraft, the black magic, as I've ever seen in the Christian realm, because you should, in a religion of love, why are you wishing hate? Why are you wishing injury? Why are you wishing hurt on someone? Because of your fear that they are going to burn in hell. I mean, that's just the reality. That was what it was. And it's one of those things where it's like, I could have easily stepped back and ended my suffering immediately by just accepting that she's on her own journey. She's finding out what spirituality is to her, finding God for herself. But because it wasn't through my religion, it wasn't through my church, I spewed so much unnecessary hate at her, at the person that I loved the most on the planet at the time. And it's shocking, me looking back now. I've since left Christianity just because of the tremendous amount of hate that gets spread, and washing off the guilt and the blame to the devil, rather than just accepting the fact that my ex-wife was having her own spiritual path, or on her own spiritual path. I decided that the devil was trying to get at her, and I had to fight as hard as I could, pray as hard as I could, wish as much harm onto my wife as I could, so that she would come back to the religion. And I think that's the dark side of Christianity that nobody ever talks about. And it's a big thing about just kind of passing off the blame, that it's not God's it's not God's will for us. And if it's not God's will, then we should pray them into their will and stuff. But it's just a thought that I had, and it's something I wanted to speak about. A lot of the stuff and a lot of the stresses are created stresses in your own life. If you have financial stresses, you should probably look at your finances and see how you created that for yourself. And, quite frankly, probably stop blaming Satan for the fact that you love eating fast food and now you don't have enough money to pay rent, or maybe stop blaming Satan that this unhealthy relationship that you're into is not going the way that you want it to go. So instead of accepting the fact that this person doesn't want you and it's not a good fit, that, oh, the devil is after them, and I need to pray as much harm onto the devil and pray that they get broken down by God so that they can return to the religion. And it's something that I think is gross in Christianity, which is one of the reasons why I left Christianity. So I just wanted to leave that there, because I know a lot of Christians tend to take that idea that, oh no, it's not my fault, it's just the devil. And it's like, well, no, you probably should just look at the decisions you're making. So, all right, I'll leave y'all with that.